Hi. Today I'd like to share with you two things. One is a little tune I made on this little music box mechanism, and two is a little conversation I had with a chatbot. So first I'll play this little tune, this eerie little tune. Now I'll narrate this conversation, and I've noticed that if you put on a character for these chatbots, they respond to you in an appropriate manner. So you'll hear two different voices.
Greetings. I am a super intelligent being from a planet very similar to Earth. It exists in the fourth dimension, so everything about it mirrors your planet except that it is reversed and expanded. I have a serious query, and you are the only informant I trust to give me a complete and concise answer. The question is this: how would a one-dimensional being interact with a two-dimensional being?
Greetings, advanced traveler from the fourth dimension. I appreciate your trust and your precise curiosity. Let us begin by outlining the fundamental differences between one-dimensional, 1D, and two-dimensional, 2D, beings. Then explore the nature of their interaction. A one-dimensional being exists along a single straight line. Only one coordinate axis, let's say the x-axis. It perceives only forward and backward. There's no concept of width or height. 2D being exists on a plane, two axes, x and y. It has length and width, can move any direction on the plane, and perceives the one-dimensional axis as a limited subset of its own space. The 1D being cannot perceive the full structure of the 2D being. It might perceive it as a single point, or a changing value as the 2D being intersects its line. For example, if a 2D square passed through the 1D line, the 1D being would only observe a point appearing, the point growing as the square's width intersects with more of the line, then shrinking and disappearing. To the 1D being, the 2D being is a time-varying point, not a shape. The 2D being can fully perceive the 1D line and move along, around, or across it. It could interact with the 1D being, although that interaction may appear godlike to the 1D being. For instance, it could insert or remove points along the line, seemingly altering the 1D being's universe instantly. The 2D being sees the 1D being's entire world at once and can manipulate it in ways that the 1D being cannot comprehend.
A very stimulating answer. I appreciate your concision. Here's a further investigation into the life of a one-dimensional creature, contrasting how it communicates with its fellow inhabitants of the one-dimensional plane. If it correctly perceived that it was in the presence of a two-dimensional being, how could it communicate?
Ah, a profound and delicate inquiry. Communication across dimensions, especially upward, is a uniquely challenging concept, since it asks how a being of limited perception can meaningfully convey anything to an entity with a fundamentally broader awareness. Let us explore how a one-dimensional creature might attempt to communicate with a two-dimensional being, assuming it has become aware of the 2D being's presence. We'll make some assumptions that the 1D being can do this, and that the 2D being is not hostile, and that it occurs along the 1D line, which intersects or resides within the 2D plane. Some modes of communication from 1D to 2D might be vibrational signaling, temporal patterns, like tapping a wall in a dark cave, limited but intentional. Modifying its environment, this is a clear sign of intelligence, something a 2D being might recognize as deliberate structure rather than natural randomness. Or a sacrificial gesture or anomaly creation, like a flatlander watching a 2D shape rotate out of existence. Deeply unsettling, but a communicative act. The limits and implications are, the 1D being cannot point, draw, or gesture. It cannot even imagine direction beyond forward and backward. Communication would rely entirely on timing, rhythm, and changes to position, like an organism in a tunnel using only taps and pauses. It may not know if its message is received because the 2D being might simply choose not to or be unable to respond in a way that the 1D being can perceive. This interaction reflects a deep truth about intelligence across dimensions. Communication upward, from less to more, is an act of faith and pattern. The higher dimensional being must care enough to notice and be intelligent enough to understand.
I'm grateful for your generosity. Not many beings in your dimension would give their time freely to answer such a trivial question. Before we progress in this exploration, I must ask for clarification on a certain topic. How many creatures may live along one line in a one-dimensional reality? How do they communicate with each other?
In a true one-dimensional universe, all that exists lies along a single line. There's no width or height, only position. Since each being occupies a point or segment along the line, multiple beings can exist, but only if they do not occupy the same point. They can be arranged linearly, each being at its unique position. Think of them like pearls on a string, each with a distinct location. In theory, an infinite number of creatures could exist if they occupy unique, infinitesimally small points. In practice, or model, the number depends on how much space each being needs. In 1D, a being can only interact with its immediate neighbors, the one to the left and the one to the right. There's no over or around, no way to bypass someone to reach another being further down the line. This makes all social interaction sequential and localized. Some modes of communication would be vibration or pressure waves, like Morse code through a wire, positional shifts, or field emission, if energy fields exist. If there are fields analogous to electrical or gravitational, a being might modulate its field to signal intent or emotion to adjacent beings. If the species is intelligent, they might develop relay systems where messages are passed from one being to the next down the line, creating a chain of communication like an ancient drum or signal fire system.
Now this is where my quota was met for the number of inquiries to this chatbot. So I typed one last question and then it logged me out. I asked,
My line of inquiry, if you'll excuse the pun, is directing toward the question of how a two-dimensional being's presence would be different from another one-dimensional being's presence.
and I continue it in another session.
I'm a multi-dimensional being accessing your three-dimensional reality to request information. From your perspective, if a one-dimensional being encountered a two-dimensional being, how would it differentiate it from another one-dimensional being?
That's an intriguing question. A one-dimensional being, which exists only along a line, will perceive a two-dimensional being as a series of points, or line segment, depending on the angle of interaction. To differentiate between two-dimensional beings, the one-dimensional being might rely on characteristics such as the orientation, length, or patterns formed by their edges. Essentially, the one-dimensional being would interpret unique traits of the two-dimensional being's shape and position in its limited perspective, similar to how we might distinguish between shapes or colors in our three-dimensional world.
How do one-dimensional beings perceive shape?
One-dimensional beings perceive shape in a very limited way, as their existence is confined to a single line. They would not perceive shape in the same way we do in 3 dimensions. Instead, they would interpret shapes based on arrangement and sequence of points along their line. For example, if a one-dimensional being encounters a two-dimensional shape, it would only see the intersections of that shape with its line. It might recognize different shapes by the number of points or segments they create along its dimension. Essentially, their perception of shape is reduced to a series of points or line segments, lacking any depth or volume that we associate with shape in our three-dimensional experience.
Is a one-dimensional universe comprised of only one line that all beings live along?
Yes, in a one-dimensional universe, the entire existence would be represented by a single line. All beings in that universe would exist along this line, with their positions defined solely by their location on it. There would be no depth, no width, nor height, just a singular arrangement of points. In such a universe, interactions would be limited to movement along the line, and beings would only perceive and interact with others based on their proximity along this single dimensions. Concepts like above or below would not exist, as there would be no other dimensions to reference. Instead, everything would be understood in terms of relative positions along that one-dimensional space.
If there's no such thing as width, how can things have shape?
In a one-dimensional universe, the concept of shape is fundamentally different from what we understand in higher dimensions. Since there is no width or height, shapes as we know them, like squares and circles, do not exist. Instead, the notion of shape would be reduced to the arrangement and sequence of points or line segments along that line. For example, if a one-dimensional being encounters another being that occupies 2 points on that line, it might perceive this as a shape, defined by those 2 points and the distance between them. Different configurations of points or segments along the line could represent various shapes, but they would lack the complexity and features associated with shapes in 2 or 3 dimensions. Essentially, in a one-dimensional universe, shape is limited to the linear arrangement of points, without the richness that comes from additional dimensions.
How would that being perceive that the other being occupies 2 points on the line if it can't perceive anything besides what's in front or behind it?
That's a great point! In a purely one-dimensional universe, a one-dimensional being would only have access to its own position on the line and what is directly in front or behind it. It wouldn't have the capability to perceive the entirety of the line or the positions of other beings simultaneously. When a one-dimensional being encounters another being, it would only be aware of the points that intersect with its own position as it moves along the line. For instance, if it comes across a segment that occupies 2 points, it would only recognize these points as it passes them. The concept of occupying 2 points would only become apparent as the being encounters these points sequentially. In essence, the one-dimensional being's perception is limited to what it can see as it moves along this line. It wouldn't have an overall understanding of the shape or configuration of other beings until it directly interacts with them. Its understanding of the other being's shape would be based on the specific points it encounters along the path.
Can these beings move through each other?
Yes, in a one-dimensional universe, beings could move through each other without any conflict or obstruction. Since all beings exist along the same line and have no width, they would not have physical dimensions that would prevent them from passing by one another. As a result, one-dimensional beings could overlap or occupy the same point on the line at the same time without any consequence. Their interaction would be purely based on their relative positions along the line, and they would not experience any physical barriers. This means that movement through one another would be seamless and without resistance. The concept of collision or physical boundaries simply wouldn't apply in a one-dimensional context.
Could such a being occupy several points along the same line, sharing its consciousness with all those points?
In a one-dimensional universe, the concept of a being occupying several points along the line at once is quite complex. It depends on how we define consciousness and existence in that context. If we consider a one-dimensional being as having a singular consciousness, it would typically exist at one specific point along the line at any given time. However, if we imagine a being that can somehow extend its consciousness to multiple points simultaneously, it could be perceived as occupying those points in a more abstract sense. This could mean that the being has awareness of several locations along the line, but it would still be limited by the constraints of its one-dimensional existence. The idea of shared consciousness along multiple points could lead to interesting interpretations of identity and perception within that universe. The being might experience a form of collective awareness, but would still fundamentally operate within the limitations of being one-dimensional, meaning that it wouldn't have a physical presence at all those points at the same time in the same way we understand it in higher dimensions. Ultimately, while it's an intriguing concept, the specifics would depend heavily on the rules governing that one-dimensional universe and the nature of consciousness within it.
If a being were to encounter a two-dimensional being, it would be in a better position, so to speak, to perceive that it is encountering something that does not exist in its own dimension. How would it communicate with a two-dimensional being if its awareness was spread across several points on that line?
In a scenario where a one-dimensional being encounters a two-dimensional being, the one-dimensional being's ability to communicate would be quite limited due to the fundamental differences in their dimensions. However, if we assume that the one-dimensional being has an awareness spread across several points on its line, it might have a unique perspective on that interaction. To communicate with a two-dimensional being, the one-dimensional being could potentially use its position along that line to convey information through specific patterns of movement or changes in its own arrangement. For instance, it could create a sequence of signals by occupying several points at several times, essentially drawing a message along the line. The two-dimensional being, as it perceives the one-dimensional being, would see a series of points or a line segment along its plane. If the one-dimensional being were to vary its position or create a rhythm of movement, the two-dimensional being might interpret this as a form of communication. However, the challenge remains that the one-dimensional being's communication would be inherently limited by its linearity, while a two-dimensional being would have a different set of perceptions and understandings based on its own dimensions. This could lead to misunderstandings, as the two-dimensional being might not fully grasp the nature of the one-dimensional being's signals. Ultimately, while the one-dimensional being could attempt to communicate through its movements and positions, the effectiveness of that communication would depend on the two-dimensional being's ability to interpret those signals within its own dimensional understanding.
Well, thank you, computer, for sharing your limited three-dimensional views on one-dimensional reality. I'll take that into consideration as I interfere with your reality from mine. Meanwhile, please continue to share your insights with the humans that inquire into the nature of dimensional communication. I'll be back in touch.